Good evening, as it was said by the Pope recently. Well, I hope that the Beinecke people will not be upset if I start with an homage to the Sterling Library. It was there that I got the first idea of the library I imagined for my novel, The Name of the Rose. It happened when I was exploring one of the mezzanines which you could not reach by the elevator and were pretty somber and funereal, so that at a certain moment I felt lost, unable to find a way out. And at that moment I had the vivid impression that if I have killed somebody, putting the corpse somewhere under the shelves, it took a lot of time before it was discovered. And that's with such a peaceful and gentle picture in my mind, I started designing my own library as a labyrinth, keeping in mind that, according to a medieval definition, unc mundum typice labyrinthus denotat ille, that is, a labyrinth is a model for the world. But if the labyrinth is an image of our world, a library is a labyrinth. Then, by a transitive property, a library is an image, a model, and an ersatz of our world. But since our world, such as we know it, is the one depicted by our culture, that a labyrinthine library is the equivalent of our culture insofar as culture, in the anthropological sense of this term, is a system of ideas, data, values, habits, and traditions that all the members of a given group are sharing, so that it existed a Greek culture of the age of Pericles, as well as it exists a Bantu culture. If you run deliriously through a library, you can be peopled by a still unhinged multitude of bookish echoes of your previous cultural experience. Abraham begat Isaac, and Isaac begat Jacob, and Jacob begat the man of La Mancha, and that was when I saw the pendulum on the branch of Como Lake, where late a sweet bird sang the snows of yesterday softly falling into the dark, mutinous Shannon waves. Monsieur les Anglais, je me suis couché de bonheur. Time by any other name is out of joint. The women come and go. A kiss is just a kiss, and the rose is a rose is a rose. To quoque alea. A man without quality shouldn't ask what he can do for his country. Beauty is true, truth is beauty. Too many rings around roses because happy families are all alike. See, la musique ou marche de colombe, go where the lemon blossoms. Once upon a time the earth was without form. Licht mehr, Licht über alles. Count as what is life? Names, names, names. Julien Sorel, Lord Bramwell, Pindar, Flaubert, Disraeli, Jurassic Park, Madame de Pompadour, Smith and Wesson, Rosa Luxemburg, Archaeopteryx, Matthew, Mark, Luke, Joan, Pinocchio, Justine, Thais, the whore with the shitty fingernails, Osteoporosis, Antonore, Bacta, Batana, Persepolis, Susa, Bela, Alexander's Ragtime, and the Gordian Knot. That is all you know on earth and all we need to know. Once Thomas Pavel, a colleague of mine, invited us to try a fascinating mental experiment. Let's suppose that an omniscient being is capable of writing or reading a magnum opus that contains all the true assertions regarding both the real world and all possible worlds. Naturally, since we speak of the universe using different languages, and since each language defines the world in a different way, there exists a maximal collection or the total image of magna opera. Let's now suppose that God charges a number of angels with writing daily books for each individual human being in which they take note of all the propositions concerning the possible worlds of that individual's desires and hopes and the real world of his acts that correspond to a true statement in one of the books that make up the maximal collection of Magna Opera. The collection of daily books belonging to a given individual must be produced on the day of judgment, along with the collection of the books concerning family, tribes, and nations. But the benevolent angels who write a daily book are not content to align true statements. They connect them, evaluate them, and build them into a system. And since on the day of judgment, individuals and groups will each have a defending angel, the defenders will rewrite for each individual another astronomical series of daily books in which the same statements will be linked together in a different way and differently compared to the affirmation of some of the Magna Opera. Since infinite alternative worlds make up each of the infinite Magna Opera, the angels will write an infinite number of daily books in which affirmations that are true in one world are false in the other, and they will be mingled together. If we further hypothesize that some of the angels may be clumsy and mix up affirmation registered as mutually contradictory by a single magnum opus, what we will end up with will be a series of miscellaneous compendiums of fragments of miscellaneous that amalgamate a stratus of books of different origins, and at that point it will be very difficult to say which books are truthful and which fictional, and with respect to what the original. We will have an astronomical infinity of books, each of which we straddle different worlds, and we will no doubt consider as true stories that others have considered as fictional. This gives us a good idea of what a maximal encyclopedia might look like. If we substitute for the angels all the human beings who left behind their traces from the bisons of Altamira to the invention of writing and beyond, the legend Pavel narrates gives a reasonable representation of our situation when confronted by the universe of affirmation that we are accustomed to accept not as true, but in any case as once expressed. Is the picture provided by Pavel an image of the culture we live in? Happily not, because confronted with the virtual immensity of the maximal encyclopedia, which is a regulatory hypothesis, we usually attempt to reduce its format, to construct local representation with the purpose of understanding a single context. This means that a culture is not only a way for storing our memories, but also a way to filter them. Speaking of the meaning of a given term, we usually refer to a standard set of notions on the basis of which both a lay person and a naturalist can agree on the properties evoked by the term mouse, both understanding in the same way the sentence, "There is a mouse in the kitchen." But for the same word, mouse, there is also a specialized knowledge shared only by naturalists. So on the one hand, there is a standard encyclopedia shared in the present case both by the naturalist, the common native speaker, and on the other, an unmanageable plethora of specialized encyclopedias, the complete collection of which would constitute the unattainable maximal encyclopedia of which Pavel was speaking. Accordingly, we could imagine the states of strata, or what Hilary Putnam has called the social division of linguistic labor, by thinking of a kind of solar system, the maximal encyclopedia, in which a great many specialized encyclopedias describe orbits of varying circumferences around the central nucleus, the standard encyclopedia. So it could happen that the works of Plato, except for the Timaeus, were not part of the standard encyclopedia of medieval culture, while it is still part of our current Western encyclopedia, the idea that the Ptolemaic system was believed to be true in the past, whereas it is today considered erroneous without its being forgotten. To sum up, we might say that the official standard encyclopedia of our present Western culture is represented by the 32 volumes of the Britannica, while single members of our culture share only a part of it, according to the format of the education they received, so that a mid-cultivated person master more or less a mid-sized one volume of general information. It happens with the format on one's encyclopedical information, what happens with the difference between the number of words mastered by a newly immigrated taxi driver and a university professor. Besides, once I met in Florence an official of a Washington agency who, while tasting a delicious fish from the Italian coast, asked whether the Mediterranean was a salt or freshwater lake. I obviously answered that it was salt, adding that in fact it was bigger than Philadelphia. In fact, even though all the content of a standard encyclopedia are not shared by all the members of a given culture, a cultivated person may have forgotten or never have known the date of Napoleon's death, but knows where that information is accessible. An educated person is not someone who knows the dates of the beginning and the end of the 7 Years' War, but someone who can come up with them in a short time. The standard encyclopedia cannot be identified with an extensive library containing thousands, even millions of volumes, because such a library, though it may not be commensurate with the maximal encyclopedia, nevertheless encompasses the standard encyclopedias of exotic cultures, of past civilization, and ideally all of the specialized encyclopedias, past and present. Let's say that the Sterling is such a kind of encyclopedia. The Beinecke is instead a patchwork of specialized encyclopedias of different ages and cultures. The fact that not just the maximal encyclopedia, but even the parody of it represented by a normal library should provoke the vertigo of a knowledge so exaggeratedly extensive that nobody could ever capture or contain in their own individual memories, leads us to the problem of memory and forgetfulness. The problem, in other words, of the vertigo of the labyrinth. Since classical antiquity, the problem of the need to forget appears contemporaneously with the development of mnemonic techniques by which to commit to memory the maximum amount of information, especially in the centuries in which information was not as readily obtainable and transportable as it happened with the invention of printing and subsequently of electronic device. So a scholar had to go around with techniques able to make him to remember the encyclopedia he had not in his hands. The classical example, which you can find here in the Mellon collection of mnemotechnics, is based on the construction, on the imaginary construction, and sometimes on the design, the construction of a complex spatial image, a palace, a square, a city, where there are architectural items or statues, many representing strange or terrifying facts, to which one could associate every kind of data, concepts, logical principles, events, and so on. So that by figuring out or visiting the place and remembering these images, one could remember a complete system of notions. Sometimes it was more difficult to remember the mnemonic images than the data to be retrieved. And one of the terrors of the practitioners of mnemonics was that of remembering so much as to confound, as a result their ideas and forget practically everything. It seems, in fact, that at a certain point in his life, Giulio Camillo, who constructed a big theater of memory, maybe you have read about it in the books of Francis Yates, Giulio Camillo had to excuse himself for his confused state and for the gaps in his memory, citing as an explanation his protracted and frantic application to his theaters of memory. On the other hand, in this polemic against arts of memory, Cornelius Agrippa, in the Vanitate Scientiarum, claimed that the mind is rendered obtuse by those monstrous images, and by being so overburdened is led to madness. Hence, parallel to the fortunes of the artes memoriae, the reappearance from time to time of the phantasm of an ars oblivionalis, an art of forgetting. In De Oratore, for example, Cicero cites the case of Themistocles, who was gifted with an extraordinary memory. When someone offered to teach him an ars memorandi, a mnemotechnique, Themistocles replied that his interlocutor would be doing him a greater kindness if he taught him how to forget what he wished to forget than if he taught him how to remember, inasmuch as he would prefer to be able to forget something he didn't wish to remember than to remember everything he had once heard or seen. So in the lesson 20 of his Pluto Sophia, Filippo Gesualdo, 1592, reviewed many methods for oblivion. Gesualdo is aware that Johannes Pangerbergius, in his Libellus Artificiose Memoriae, reminded his readers that people forget from corruption, that is, from forgetfulness of past species, by diminution, old age and sickness, and from ablation of cerebral organs. Likewise, it is obvious that we can forget by drunkenness and drugs, but that was not the problem of Filippo Gesualdo. His intent was to develop an art of forgetting that employed the same techniques of an art of remembering. And so he advised, quote, first, having recited and wishing to consign the images to oblivion, either in the daytime with closed eyes or at night in darkness, you should go wandering with your mind through all the imagined place, evoking an obscure nocturnal gloom that hides all the place, and proceeding in this fashion and going back a number of times with the mind and not seeing any image, every figure will soon disappear. Go peering in all the place with the mind back and forth, and contemplate them empty and bare as they were formed for the first time without any images in them, and this operation should be performed several times. Just as the painter passes over and whitewashes his paintings to cancel them, so we too can cancel the images with color painted over them. And these colors are white, green, or black, imagining over the place white curtains, green sheets of black cloths, and going over the place of a number of times with these veils of colors. And one can also imagine the place stuffed with straw, hay, firewood, merchandise, etc. I consider an excellent rule to put in a place new figures, because just as one nail drives out another, so forming new images and putting them in the place already imagined, cancel the first images from our memory. It is true that it is necessary to imprint them with great care and mental effort, and to repeat them frequently in the darkness and in the quiet of the night, so that the intense and vivid idea of the second ones drives out the first ideas. Or imagine a great storm of winds, hail, dust, ruin the buildings and places and temples, a flood that leaves everything in a state of confusion. And when this noxious thought has continued for a while and been repeated several times, finally go walking among the places with your mind, imagining the weather bright and calm and peaceful, and seeing the place empty and bare as they were formed for the first time. And imagine a man who is hostile, terrible, and fearsome, with which a troop of armed companions enter and passes impetuously among the places, and with scourges, staves, and other weapons drives out the likenesses, assaults the people, shatters the images, puts to flight through doors and windows all the animals and animated persons who were in place. Until after the tumult has passed and the ruin, seeing the place with a mind recovered from its terror, they will be seen bare and vacant as before. And if this destruction were to occur on the hands of hostile armies, such as the Turks and pagans, it would be even more effective, because that terror confounds things and sets everything upside down. They are the rules for forgetting. Try this night at home and see what happens. We don't know whether anyone ever put into practice the artifices Gesualdo recommended, but we are entitled to suspect that all the stratagems made it possible not to forget, but to remember better what he wanted to forget, and to remember it with greater intensity, as it occurs when lovers try to blot out the image of the person who has abandoned them, and the more they cancel, the more the countenance of the beloved vividly resurface. And I think it's a common experience. The psychological and physiological reasons why an ars oblivionalis is impossible depends on the contiguity, similarity, dialectic on which the classical mnemonic systems are founded. If an object X has been imagined to be in contact with an object Y, or if an object X is in some way homologous or similar with the object Y, every time the object Y is evoked, so is the object Y. But if this is how the artes memoriae work, it is hard to see how one can imagine an object X that, when evoked, somehow acts on our cerebral cortex by canceling Y. How then to forget undesirable information? While we already encountered the problem in Themistocles through Cicero, the dread of excess certainly increases with the invention of printing, which not only makes available an enormous quantity of textual material, but also facilitates access to it for the man in the street, and leads from the primacy of remembrance to the primacy of forgetting. Thus, we witness the development of an art not unknown in the centuries of manuscript culture, by which acquires central importance in the culture of print the ars excerpendi, that is, the art of compiling abstracts or summaries as to retain only the knowledge we judge it as indispensable, and to let marginal information fall by the wayside. In any case, what we may call the Themistocles complex returns over and over again in the course of cultural history. And one of its most dramatic manifestations is surely the second of Nietzsche Untimely Meditations, which deals with the advantages and disadvantages of historical studies for life. And Nietzsche wrote about, quote, the capacity to sense things unhistorically. The person who cannot set himself down on the crest of the moment, forgetting everything from the past, who is not capable of standing on a single point like a goddess of victory without dizziness or fear, will never know what happiness is. Even worse, he will never do anything to make other people happy. Imagine the most extreme example. A person who did not possess the power of forgetting at all, who would be condemned to see every word coming into being. Such a person no longer believes in his own being, no longer believes in himself, sees everything in moving points flowing out of each other, and loses himself in his stream of becoming. He will, like the true pupil of Heraclitus, finally hardly dare anymore to lift his finger. Forgetting belongs to all action, just as both light and darkness belong in the life of all organic things. A person who wanted to feel utterly and only historically would be like someone who was forced to abstain from sleep, or like the beast that is to continue its life only from rumination to constantly repeated rumination. For this reason, if it is possible to live almost without remembering, it is generally completely impossible to live without forgetting. Or, to explain more clearly concerning my thesis, there is a degree of insomnia, of rumination, of the historical sense through which living comes to harm and finally is destroyed, whether it is a person or a people or a culture. End of the Nietzschean quote. This is for Nietzsche, in his meditation, the starting point for an analysis of the negative effects of the excess of historical studies, which at these times had reached such an unbearable complexity and richness to oppress the memory of a culture. And now comes the call for youth to develop an art of forgetfulness. One of the interesting things about this text is that while these remarks seem to address the individual's need for survival, the emphasis changes to the need for a systematic forgetting on the part of a culture in general. This switch is of capital importance because once the impossibility of voluntary forgetting was what the individual memory has recorded as being demonstrated, then cultures present themselves as a system that functions not only to preserve and hand down information useful to their survival, but also to cancel the information judged to be in excess. A culture is surely a device for storing and preserving and collecting memory, a system of data and values. And when all this treasury of information is lost, that culture collapses and disappears. But a culture is at the same time a device for limiting an excess of information. A culture has historical memory, is not only a stack of data, it's also the result of their percolation. It represents our ability in throwing away everything we do not consider useful or necessary. The history of a civilization is made up with millions of data which have been buried. Frequently we have discovered that such a process was lost, and we needed centuries to retrieve lost information. Our Greek ancestors had forgotten the Egyptian mathematics, and the Middle Ages had forgotten great part of the Greek science. Likewise, we have by now forgotten the meaning of the statues of the Easter Island, and many of the tragedies quoted by Aristotle in his Poetics are definitely lost. However, in spite of these undesirable accidents, a culture must eliminate a lot of information. By the way, this process of cancellation not only holds for cultures, but also for our personal life. Jorge Luis Borges, who certainly had read the pages of Nietzsche I was just quoting, wrote, as you probably know, a beautiful story, Funes el Memorioso, on a character, Funes, Ireneo Funes, who remembers everything. Every leaf he saw in his childhood, every word he heard in the course of his life, every murmur of wind he felt on his skin, every sentence he read. Just because of such total memory, Funes was an idiot, paralyzed by his inability to filter and to throw away the result of his experiences. Our unconscious works because it removes. If then something disturbs us, we ask our psychoanalyst to retrieve what we removed because it was too embarrassing. But it was important to eliminate all the rest, and our soul is the product of such a selective memory. If we had the fullness memory, we would be animals without soul, that is, without identity. Our identity is made not only by what we remember, but also by what we succeeded in forgetting. However, a culture frequently doesn't only make individuals forget what they know or knew. It also keeps them from them finding out what they do not know yet. A century and a half after Nietzsche's text, reflection on cultural forgetting has intensified, and without renewing the provocation of Nietzsche's cry of alarm, the process of cancellation continuously performed by a culture simply in order to stay alive today appears normal. Identifying memory and culture, today we study the forgetting that the culture mobilizes through various kinds of cancellation, which can range from censure, the erasure of manuscripts, bonfires of books, damnatio memoriae, forgery of documentary sources, negationism, until forgetfulness out of shame, inertia, remorse, down to those processes current in exact science in which it is decided that not only the hypothesis proven erroneous, but even the efforts and procedures followed to arrive at the correct ones are expunged from the specialized encyclopedia of a particular science because it is believed that they are no longer useful, which provokes terrifying holes in the scientific bibliographies. Such a loss of memory is disastrous for a culture. But today, if not in the humanities, at least in hard science, things go this way. And in many scientific essays, you cannot find bibliographical data older than 10 years. As I was saying yesterday, this happens even in the humanities. Once I found a philosophical text suggesting that the given idea was already present in Kant, and the footnote read C. Brown, 1998. If the specialized encyclopedias are subject to the process of forgetting, so much more so is the standard encyclopedia of a given culture. It guarantees remembrance of the important historical facts or of the principles of physics, but it omits an infinite amount of information that the collectivity has repressed because it decided it was not useful nor pertinent. Our standard encyclopedia provides precious details about the progress of the Battle of Waterloo, but it doesn't give us the names of all the participants, including, obviously, the 50,000 casualties. It tells us all we need to know about the death of Julius Caesar, but nothing about what his widow, Calpurnia, did after the assassination of her husband. This is not a case of male chauvinism, because the same encyclopedia records everything that happened to Clara Schumann after the death of Robert, since Clara continued her career as a distinguished pianist and presumably had a tortured love affair with Brahms. It simply means that the fate of the poor Calpurnia was not relevant for the history of our civilization, as well as the fact that at Waterloo, a given Jean Dupont died instead of a John Smith. It was useful to forget this data so as not to overload the collective memory more than it can bear, and without rendering the filtered or censored facts irretrievable, since there do exist specialized individuals, let's say historians or archaeologists, capable of bringing them to light. In such cases, the collective memory sometimes picks up on the data, restoring them to the standard encyclopedia, and sometimes decide instead to leave them in some specialized Indian reservations. The filtering performed by the standard encyclopedia doesn't depend on the will of an individual or on a conscious act of collective will. It occurs out of a kind of inertia, sometimes even from natural causes, like the cancellation of precise information regarding Atlantis, if it never existed. The problem of filtering by a standard encyclopedia was in any case already present among the medieval encyclopedists, even though they seem to us to be intent on handing on everything that tradition has handed on to them. In the Libellum Apologeticum that serves as an introduction to his Speculum Maius, Vincent of Beauvais is already shocked by the proliferation of knowledge. This is why he decides to make his encyclopedia a florilegium, in other words, a selection of the best of his readings. Not to be suspected of censorship, Vincent quotes the so-called Decretum Gelasianum de Libris Recipiendis et Non Recipiendis, a compendium on what was either apocryphal or canonical in the Holy Scripture. And Vincent decided to quote also forbidden books, so that his readers could make a distinction between true and false texts and decide what to trust and what to forget. But in this sense, certain texts survived only because Vincent included them in his Speculum Maius, even though it included them as wrong texts. All a culture does, then, is to select the data for its own memory. It may not do what Stalin did when he erased from historical photographs the face of the comrades he had sent to death, or what the Orwell's Big Brother did when he corrected the news in the Times every morning. But when we read it, that some English school proposed to abolish the teaching of the Crusades so as not to offend the sensibilities of their Muslim students, it becomes apparent that culture is a continual process of rewriting and selecting information. What distinguishes a big library like Beinecke from that of a high school or from the personal one of an educated but not specialized person. I said that if we read Aristotle's Poetics, we find the mention of many tragedies which have not survived until our times. We do not know why these tragedies got lost, as well as the names of their authors. A naive hypothesis is that Sophocles, Aeschylus, and Euripides survived because they were the best ones. The best ones according to which criterion? By which inscrutable reasons they were selected and entered in the canon. Maybe marvelous lost tragedies were censured, maybe by corruption and bribery, and Athenian authority ordered that Sophocles was performed more frequently than some of its unfortunate companions. How to repair to those unpleasant accidents? Cultures, at least our Western culture, philologically oriented, cultures are concerned with the possibility to retrieve data whose loss we consider a disgrace. That is why we need the work of specialists supposed to resurrect notions and experience which by accident sank in the dark. In doing this, the collective memory is able to re-emerge these data and puts them again in the standard encyclopedia or in some specialized one. It is why a mature culture decides to put some information in a latency state. Exceeding information is or was, so to speak, deeply frozen, so that when it is necessary, experts can put them in an ideal microwave oven to retrieve it again, for instance, in order to decipher an old document newly discovered. The latency places are represented by the model of a library or the archive as the indispensable containers of a wisdom that can be revisited even though it was not revisited for centuries. Naturally, there are cases of very, very deep latency, in the sense that something had been really forgotten and ignored for centuries, and no library was able to store, and that sometimes is rediscovered by chance, like the Riace bronzes, which since centuries were buried in the deep sea, or the Dead Sea Scrolls, or the Nag Hammadi manuscripts. In this case, a culture must rewrite its files and enrich either its specialized encyclopedias or the standard one, or both. No encyclopedia, no library keep notes of all the soldiers who took part in the Waterloo battle. On the contrary, we have the complete list of the 1,000 Garibaldini that went to Garibaldi to conquer Sicilia. We have all the names, but they were less than the fighters at Waterloo. Let's now suppose that a scholar succeeds in putting his hands on an as yet unknown archive and finds these names. I do not know how useful it can be to have all those names, but we can then move these data from an inaccessible maximum encyclopedia and insert them into a hyper-specialized one. And perhaps that list could be hosted by the Sterling Library, or, if written on a 19th century manuscript, by the Beinecke one. To which encyclopedia belong the texts of the lost tragedies mentioned by Aristotle? Until now, a specialized literary encyclopedia can simply record the datum that of these texts. We know only the titles. What will happen if these texts will never be retrieved? For the very fact that there are good reasons to believe that they once existed, if Aristotle was not a damned liar, we will keep going on thinking that they could belong to the maximal encyclopedia, the one described by Pavel with his History of Angels, even though belong to it only virtually and in an optative way. Thus, the maximal encyclopedia, if the term only lets us to think of something cuius nihil maius cogitari possit, something on which nothing greater can be thought of, like the God of Anselm of Canterbury, is a structure virtually accordion-like, which can one day or another be stretched in infinitum, which is not a little encouragement for the advancement of learning and the permanent hope for a great library ready to embrace in its uterus even the wisdom of tomorrow. Thank you. Bene, dov'è?
Thank you very much, Umberto Eco, for that fabulous, fabulous talk. It will keep me thinking about my own job of forgetting and remembering for a long time to come. I forgot to mention at the beginning that we have a reception to follow at the Beinecke Library, so please come and join us for a chance to follow up on this wonderful talk and to enjoy some refreshments with Umberto Eco and Umberto Pagliasco, the Due Umberto.